ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا واغفر لنا ما مضى يا واسع الكرم يا ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا واغفر لنا ما مضى يا واسع الكرم.
الحمد لله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد فقد قال الله عز وجل في شان حبيبه صلى الله عليه وسلم مخبرا وآمرا إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وصل عليه. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رسول الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا حبيب الله. الصلاة والسلام عليك يا سيدي يا رحمة للعالمين وعلى آلك وأصحابك وسلم عليك يا شفيع المذنبين. Continuing on from where we left off in our last lesson, we began the chapter of prayer, the book of prayer, Kitabus Salam. We completed the book of purification, which, as we know, like the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam had said to us, Miftahul Jannah Salah wa Miftahul Salah Tuhur, that the key to paradise is prayer, but the key to prayer is purification. So therefore, before any of the arkanat of Islam are spoken about, first purification is spoken about, and that's why in all the books of fiqh we speak about the chapter of purification first. Alhamdulillah, we spoke and dwelled into them issues and masail in relation to purification of a person before he takes part in any act of worship. After that, we have begun the chapter of prayer, and we have spoken about certain aspects of that. Now we come to the most important aspect and most important part when we learn about the chapter of prayer, and that is the chapter of Babu Shurutis Salati wa Arkaniha, the chapter of the conditions and pillars of prayer. The conditions and pillars of prayer. And briefly, I mentioned to you last lesson as well about some of the conditions, and just in brief to explain that the wujud of prayer is mawquf upon the shara'it. So meaning that anything you have, any act of worship, that act of worship is established upon its conditions. If the conditions are not fulfilled, then that worship, that act which you do, does not have no recognition until the conditions are not met. Because before you engage in that act of worship, before you begin that act of worship, there are certain conditions which have to be fulfilled in advance before that act of worship can take place. So if a person engages into that act of worship without fulfilling its conditions, without fulfilling the conditions in advance, then that act of worship has no recognition. Like for example, in prayer, what begins the prayer is the opening takbir, the takbir al-tahrima, or the takbir al-iftitah, the opening takbir. From there a person's prayer has begun. But before that, there are conditions which have to be met, and if them conditions are not met, you can do everything else as you want, or as the way it is told, the procedure, you could do that as you wish. But if the conditions are not met, then that prayer has no recognition at all. And that same thing applies to anything. For example, now after prayer, you have the chapter of, or the act of fasting, Saum. Now even in fasting, fast begins from Sahri and until Iftari, meaning from dawn to dusk, you have to stay hungry. But before that intention is made, of keeping your fast, there are conditions. Like for example, if a person is not in a state of purification, then that fast, he can make the intention, he can do whatever he wishes, but his fast is not accepted because the condition is unmet. Just like that in zakat, there's also conditions. In hajj, there are conditions as also. So every act of worship has certain shara'it, and then the wujud of that act is dependent upon the conditions. So the conditions must be met first, and then the act of worship, then that is recognized. So just like that in prayer, in the books of fiqh, the fuqaha, according to the Ahnaf, have mentioned the number of how many conditions there are. But I will not mention a number here, because here different numbers are mentioned according to different fuqaha. But in brief, I will tell you what are the conditions And then also they mentioned the arkan. The arkan meaning the pillars here, the rukn of prayer, the arkans. Them arkans, what it means by here, the fara'id, the compulsory parts of prayer. The compulsory parts of prayer, the fara'ids of prayer are those that the conditions and the arkan, the shara'id, shart is one condition, shara'id is the jama, the plural of condition, shart and shara'id. Then you have rukun, which is one pillar, and arkan, which is the plural. Yeah. So rukun and arkan, and you have shart and shara'id. Or for arkan, you can use the word farz and fara'id as well. So a condition of prayer is them conditions that if these conditions are not met, your prayer cannot begin. And the arkan, the pillars, are those that once the conditions are met, your prayer can begin. But if you miss out any of the pillars, then that becomes void. That becomes void. So meaning your namaz, your prayer has become void. It does not count, as what they were saying in simple language. Yeah, that prayer does not count. So two parts are here going to be mentioned in this chapter here. One are the conditions, which have to be completed and done before, and then them pillars which have to be done during the prayer. And if either one of them are out, then your prayer doesn't have no recognition or is not valid. Yeah. So first we speak about the conditions of prayer. The conditions, the shara'it of prayer are those. Firstly, you have about the purification. The purification. لا بد لصحة الصلاة من السبعة وعشرين شيئا الطهارة من الحدث والطهارة الجسد والصوب والمكان من النجس غير معفو عنه حتى موضع القدمين واليدين وركبتين والجبهة على الأصح. And now it mentions about the purity, that a person's body, his body and clothes must be clean from any sort of hadith. Hadith meaning impurity. Yeah, and impurity there's of two types, which I spoke about a few lessons ago. That you have the hadith akbar and the hadith asghar. That impurity, which is a major impurity, which demands a ghusl, the bathing, to overtake that. Like for example, after intercourse or after wet dream, etc., etc. Then that is countered by a bath. Then you have the minor impurity, which is countered by the wuzu. Yeah, so those things which break wuzu, then that is countered by the wuzu. So for prayer to take place, a person. So now the word hadith is mentioned here. There's two types of impurities in there. One is known as hadith, and what's the other one known as? Najasat. Hadith and najasat. The difference between hadith and najasat is, one is najasat is, the two types of najasat are. Anyone know what the two types of najasat are? Yeah. Or in other words, you say the ghaliza and khafifa. That which is that najasat which is visible and invisible. Yeah. And then you have hadith. Hadith is the major impurity, a minor impurity, which can be countered by through ghusl or countered through wuzu, which you can't see. Yeah. So that prayer. So the reason why najasat is not mentioned here, because najasat you'll see on your clothes, or you'll see that can be washed. But for here, the reason why hadith is mentioned is that in order for you to pray, you first have to be in a state where bathing, ghusl is not farz upon you, wajib upon you. Firstly. So basically you're not in a state of impurity, major impurity, number one. But still prayer cannot be read until you are not free from minor impurity as well. And that is counted by wuzu. So meaning that ghusl, it should not be wajib upon you. And you must be in a state of wuzu in order for you to begin prayer. So that means the first rukn here which is mentioned is about the first shart which is mentioned here is about the purity, that a person must be pure from any sort of hadith. What taharatul jasad, and the cleanliness of the body. Your body must be clean, yeah. Wa thawb wal makan, your clothing, what you wear. So whilst you're praying, that clothing which you are wearing, that clothing must be pure as well, must be clean. There must be no impurity, and the amount of impurity which I explained to you about before as well in the chapter of purity, about the coin approximately of a dirham size. which exceeds that, then your clothes become impure. So not to go into that detail again because I've mentioned that already, but when I mention the point here, you already, that should click in your mind already. Then you've got the wal makan, that the place where you are praying, that place, that makan which you are praying upon, that must be also pure. Now to go into detail about that, the fuqaha right here, that the minimum amount requirement of when you pray, of what should be clean, that place where you pray, should be how much? How many parts of your body is it farz that must be on the floor when you do sajda?
8.
7 are farz, 1 is wajib. So excluding the nose the fuqaha say that that's wajib. So it must be also, but farz they said 7. So your forehead, your 2 hands, your 2 knees, and your 2 feet. That's 7 parts. And is there any other action in prayer which demands for these parts to be on the floor at once? There's no other action in it. All the rest of the actions, you either have your 2 feet on the floor or your 2 feet and 2 knees when you're in tashahhud. Apart from that, there's no other time where the other parts of the body will be on the floor. So the most parts of the body, the aza of body, in any one action of prayer when they'll be on the floor is in sajda. 7, or we say 8. Yeah, because we'll include the wajib in there as well. Them 8 parts. So the fuqaha state that the minimum amount of makan means that place that you're praying on, that has to be clean is that parts of the floor where them 8 parts of your body will touch, they have to be clean. They have to be clean. And if, for example, other parts, there are certain parts there which are impure, as long as namaz can still be done, though it is best that all of it is clear, but the minimum amount is that them parts of the floor, or wherever you're reading upon, plank of wood or whatever it might be, that you are praying your namaz on, that them parts where your body parts will touch the floor, they have to be clean and free from any sort of impurity. So that's the condition for that in relation to that. You understand that, yeah? The next is the covering of the aura. The aura meaning that part of the body which has to be kept. Because aura means covered. The word aura itself in Arabic means covered. That part which must be veiled, covered. Aura is called. Now that's why in urf, in language, in Urdu, a woman is called aurat. Because a woman should be kept covered. That's why she's called aurat. Yeah. But in general, in linguistic terms, aura means to be covered. So a man has a aura, a part of his body which has to be covered, and a woman also has an aura as well. Now for the woman, all her body should be kept covered, apart from her feet and her hands and her face. Yeah. Though it is the ulama have stated that the covering of the veiling of the face is not compulsory, some fuqaha have stated to be wajib. Some have said that it is optional to cover the face. And the hands and feet, that can be kept. It's not that it has to be kept uncovered, but it can be kept uncovered, meaning up to the wrist and up to the ankles. Yeah, them parts of and the woman's face as well. As long as the rest of her body is covered, that's the minimum requirement for a woman. For a man, it's from his navel to below his knees. Yeah, from his belly button, navel to below his knees, that part of the man's body has to be kept covered. So when you pray, if a woman prays, she has to keep all that part of her body has to be covered. Not only during prayer, for a man and woman generally, that part of the body always has to be covered. For a man and woman. Yeah. So for example, them men that wear shorts above their knees, that's not allowed. When you wear them publicly, yeah, that's not allowed, because you're showing that part of the body which shouldn't be shown. Yeah. Or for example, for women as well, the same thing. What has to be covered for men and women, that has to be covered at all times. But in prayer, it becomes a condition that if you are not covered adequately in prayer before you begin your prayer, then your namaz will not be accepted. So the satri aurat for a man and woman has to be covered when they pray. Now, a point comes here that for a man, that if he does not have adequate dress, then whatever amount of clothing he has, he must try to cover whatever he can and pray his namaz. His namaz will be accepted. If he does not have no clothing at all to cover that part of his body. And then, if a man finds some clothing which 1/4 of that clothing, of that kapra which he's found, is filthy, 3/4 is clean, he can even use that to cover himself and pray. If it's more than 1/4, then he can't. But then still the fuqaha, right, in that sense, they also right again, some state that he can still pray with that on. Because why? The purity part of the clothing is after, but keeping his aura intact, covered, that is more important. So therefore he can even do that there and then. And what do you call it? If he has some part of clothing and he's optioned, what do I cover? The first part must be to cover his private parts. That's the first, what he has to try to cover first in order for him to pray. So basically that's the ruling in relation to the covering of the aura for a man when he prays his namaz, which is a condition in namaz. Yeah. Then after that we have the next one, which is istiqbal qibla, which is the facing towards the qibla. Now the qibla and Kaaba are two different things. Qibla and Kaaba are two different things. Because qibla means direction, and Kaaba is the actual Kaaba where we direct towards. Yeah. So that's why they're two different things. Qibla and Kaaba are two different things. So qibla is where you're facing towards, and Kaaba is what you're facing. So a person who's inside Masjid al-Haram was mentioned here. A person who's inside Masjid al-Haram, who's actually the Kaaba is right in front of him. So now the Kaaba is here. So whether he stands left, there or there or there, he's facing the Kaaba, isn't he? So he can pray wherever he wants as long as he's facing the Kaaba. And he must face the Kaaba when he's inside Masjid al-Haram. When you're outside the Haram, even if you're living in Makkah, but if you're outside the Haram, as long as you are facing towards the Kaaba, so you have to understand this, that when you're inside the Haram, you can see the Kaaba. So you have to actually face towards the cube, not anywhere else. And that's why normally safs are in straight lines in it. Now, for example, if you think now, you have a saf now of 300 people. 300 people. Now the Kaaba itself is not that wide where 300 people can stand in front of it from one side. For example, we're praying from here. The Kaaba, probably those people have gone, they probably see that the max, probably the width of the one side of the Kaaba, probably 50 to 60 people could stand line by line next to it, yeah, roughly, average, yeah, from Andazam. So now there are certain stuffs where 500 people stand in one line. Now every single one of them, the Kaaba is not directly in front of them, is it? It's not, is it? The Imams it is, but the rest ain't. So the Fuqaha state that when you are in Haram, you have to directly be in front of the Kaaba. When you're out of the Haram, as long as you're facing the direction of the Kaaba, that is enough. Yeah? As long as you're facing the direction that the Kaaba is that way, and then you're facing that way, in that direction, then that is enough. But deliberately you can't like bend the rules. But those Fuqaha stated that like in certain masajid there are issues. They say, oh, this Kaaba is slightly out, slightly here, there. In that situation, even for example, for the benefit of the musallis, meaning of the prayers, that if the, for example, now a building like this you've got, yeah, and if you were to exactly keep it point to point, and that would make it difficult for the people to pray, the Fuqaha have stated in a certain amount of degrees, some say 20, you can even change the direction slightly for the benefit of the people who will pray behind you. That's a ruling as well of the Ahnaf in relation to this issue. So that's another point in relation to the facing of the Qibla, though it is a condition that if you face away from the Qibla anywhere else, then your namaz will not be accepted. That's a condition. Then another point will come here, that if somebody prays inside the Kaaba, where does he direct towards? Yeah. So for that the Fuqaha have written as well that if somebody does, later on the chapter comments about that, about inside the Kaaba, how you pray. But briefly, if you're inside the Kaaba, then anywhere, any direction you can pray in is fine. But it is mustahab, meaning it is blessings and more rewarding and more beneficial for you to pray at that point, which is marked there, where the Prophet himself prayed when he was inside the Kaaba. That point there as well, yeah. And then there's if somebody is on top of the Kaaba and prays there, though it is makruh, is disliked to go on top of the Kaaba to pray, but it can be prayed on top of the Kaaba. If somebody is praying on top of the Kaaba, then same thing applies there as well. And same with when I mentioned the point about azan, that's what I mentioned about the azan last time, I think it was, that when you give azan, you face towards the Qibla. It's sunnat, when you give azan, you face towards the direction of the Kaaba, and in that way you perform the azan. Now when you stand on top of the Kaaba, because in early days when first azan was established, the method to give azan would be to stand on top of the Kaaba and give azan. And Sayyidina Bilal RadhiAllah Anho, who was the first person to be ordered by the Prophet ﷺ to give azan, he stood on top of the Kaaba to give azan. He was on top of the Kaaba to give azan, and when he asked the Prophet, he goes, which way do I face to give azan? That I'm standing on top of the Kaaba, which way do I face? And the Prophet never said to him, but Sayyidina Bilal himself, he looked down, and where he saw the Prophet standing, he faced towards the Prophet and gave azan.
Nare Takbir, Nare Risala, Ya Rasulullah, Nare Risala, Ya Rasulullah.
So we see that the Prophet, because the Kaaba after Kaaba is the Prophet. The reason for that is, one reason is that the hadith which is mentioned in the Dalail al-Nabuwah of Imam Bayhaqi, and also in Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal's Musnad, that Sayyida Amina RadhiAllah Anha states that when I gave birth to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I could see the Kaaba bowing down towards my house. Bowing down towards those who have gone to Umrah or Hajj. The Messenger of Allah's house, where the Mawlid of the Prophet was, Mawlid literally means, the word Mawlid itself means the time or place of birth. Mawlid is an ism zarf. Ism zarf means the time and place of something, an action when it took place. So Mawlid literally means the time and place of the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Mawlidun Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those who have gone to Umrah or Hajj in Makkah Muazzamah, that behind the Ka'batullah, behind the Masjid al-Haram, the house is still there where the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born in. So now it's turned into a library. So it's not far from the Makkah Muazzamah. If the walls weren't there, you could see it direct. So when the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was born there, Sayyidina Amina states, I saw the Kaaba bowing down towards my house. And that's why Allah Hazrat states that Awa Hajiyo Shahanshah ka roza dekho, Kaaba to dekh liya, ab Kaabe ka Kaaba dekho. And then Allah said that when I was doing Hajj, and because after my Hajj I had to go to Medina Munawwara. So at this point they're writing this nat, that Awa Hajiyo Shahanshah ka roza dekho, when they go to Medina Sharif, Kaaba to dekh liya, ab Kaabe ka Kaaba dekho. And then in the Maqta they write कि गौर से सुन तू रज़ा, रज़ा, listen carefully. So they went in the night when it was quiet. Now obviously 24 hours a day is rush there, but them days, so Allah says गौर से सुन तू रज़ा, काबे से आती है सदा. Raza, go listen carefully, you will be able to hear from the Kaaba. The Kaaba will tell you, गौर से सुन तू रज़ा, काबे से आती है सदा, कि मेरी आँखों से मेरे प्यारे का रोज़ा देखो. That, oh Raza, listen from the Kaaba is telling you, and the Kaaba is saying, Raza, look from the eyes of the Kaaba, you will be able to see the roza of my beloved. So that's why the Ashiqani Mustafa sallallahu alaihi wasallam who came before us, all of them, they all had this, and also Allah mentions कि इसके तोफ़ैल खुदा ने हज भी करा दिए. इसके तोफ़ैल. So meaning with the actual reason, iske tufal means with the blessings or with the sabab, with the reasoning of this, with the reasoning of the Prophet's Roza Mubarak, Khuda ne hajj bhi kara diye, asle murad hazari us pak dar ki hai. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made hajj compulsory upon us for the sake of the Prophet, because in reality, the reality of this journey is to be present in the majesty of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Asli murad hazari us pak dar ki hai. So when you are inside the Kaaba or on top of the Kaaba, then any direction you are in, you can pray towards that way, you can read azan towards that way. When the Prophet was there, visible, Sayyidina Bilal, he faced the Prophet and he gave the azan. That was the mazaj of Sayyidina Bilal RadhiAllah Anhu. So facing the Qibla is another condition. So if somebody directs away from the Qibla and prays, then his namaz is not accepted, that condition is not fulfilled. Further on, next point. Time. The awqat salam. The time that whichever namaz he is praying, he must be in that time frame of praying. So we explained about the times already of prayer. The timings for Fajr, Zohr, Asr, Maghrib and Isha, what the timings are. According to the Sharia, when the namaz begins, when it ends in that particular prayer. So just like that for the waqt of the prayer, that must be, the ta'ayyun must be done. You must be in that time frame for that prayer when you pray that prayer. Otherwise, without the prayer, namaz cannot be read. And you must also, this is like an offshoot of this point of waqt, that you must be sure that you are in that time. You must be in the surety of that time, that you are in that time frame. For example, now you're assuming Zohar has started, or you assumed Asr has started. Whilst you are in that assumption, you shouldn't pray namaz, because it could be possibility that you're not. When you're sure, then you should pray. Then now I'm sure that the Asr time, we are in Asr time, or we are in Zohar time, or we are in Maghrib time, then you pray. And nowadays it has become much more simple, but that's why the fuqaha, they wrote volumes on that point, of which point, that when does it start and when does it finish. So any average person, layman, could see and tell that these are the signs now that this prayer has started now or finished. So that's why when you're in the time, you be sure that now the time of prayer has started, then you could pray. If you're in doubt, mashkuk, if you're mashkuk, doubtful, or if you're assuming, then in that state you shouldn't pray. Next is intention, niyat. Now intention, making the intention for prayer is a condition as well, because intention is made before the prayer starts. So if a person does not make intention for prayer, then his prayer is not accepted. Because why? Then that person, he could be standing there making an action, because the Prophet said that intention for every action is the intention what counts really. Any action you do is the intention that really matters. So especially when it comes to prayer, which is the faraid, intention is compulsory for that reason. It's a condition. So for you to make intention for prayer.
One question, yeah. Basically, the way I got brought up here, before intention, we pray that Inni wajjahtu wajhiya alladhi fatara as-samawati wal arda Hanifa wa ma ana minal mushrikeen. Do you have to pray that?
No, you don't have to. You don't have to. But that Inni wajjahtu wajhiya alladhi fatara as-samawati wal arda Hanifa wa ma ana minal mushrikeen, that some fuqaha say that can suffice for intention. That can even suffice for it if you know what it means. But otherwise, to do ta'ayyun of normally in intention, later on it comes out what you have to mention. You have to mention what prayer you're reading, how many rakat you're reading, etc., etc. Mentioning reading behind the mutabat of the Imam, etc. These things have to be mentioned inside your intention. So that's why the Inni wajjahtu wajhi allazi, that's not compulsory to be read. The main thing is what the intention is, and that is certain things have to be mentioned in that. And amongst them, certain things are those things which we're going to speak about, those things which have to be mentioned in the intention, which come later on. Next is the takbir tahrima, which is the first takbir. And here is mentioned what tahrimati bila fasil, that to do the takbir tahrima without any break, meaning once the intention is made for prayer, then for example, I'm standing here now, I make an intention to read namaz, and then I go off and do something else, and then I come back and I'll keep that old intention and do takbir. That's not allowed. That you have to do the takbir, and that takbir that you do has to be done straight away after you've made the intention. So meaning there shouldn't be too much break in between. And what the fuqaha state in relation to that is that what the meaning by the break here is that, for example, now you've stood now in prayer, and now the Imam is about to, for example, begin the prayer. You made your intention. Now sometimes you wait a couple of seconds until the Imam starts, that's fine. As long as you're in your same state where you made the intention in and you've not done no other action, major action, which breaks you away from that intention of prayer and diverts you towards something else. So therefore, when you make the intention, after that there should not be no break in between, a gap of any other action when you do the takbir, the opening takbir of tahrima. And the takbir al-tahrima must be done standing before you go into ruku. So what it means by this is that after takbir al-tahrima, the first farz is ruku, which take place here. And ruku, obviously, you go down for that. Now what happens sometimes that if you join the prayer late, and the prayer, for example, the people are in ruku, you can't do anything else and do takbir al-tahrima halfway going down, or just start like that. So the takbir al-tahrima has to be done standing, and then you go into the action of ruku. So meaning what is mentioned here is that takbir al-tahrima must be done in the standing position, and then you go into ruku or whatever position you're going to go into, but it has to be done standing. Yeah, that's that.